Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the Alternate Historian. Well, it appears the Cold War is back on, which makes this video unfortunately relevant. Despite the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, there are still enough nuclear weapons stockpiled to turn every city in the Northern Hemisphere into glowing parking lots. Sure, the chances of it happening are still thankfully low, but one only has to look at the news coming out of Iran, North Korea, or Russia to realize we aren't out of the atomic age yet. Our entire world has been impacted by the bombs built and tested in the hot New Mexico sun. If you want to read a good book on the subject, I recommend The Bomb Alive by Gerard J. de Groot, who gives a pretty detailed history of the bomb with some dark humor thrown in. Tales of nuclear apocalypse are rife through genre fiction, and alternate history is no exception. In fact, World War III stories are perhaps some of the most popular topics in alternate history, and even my channel has a couple videos on that particular what if. But what if nuclear weapons were never invented? What if our world was nuclear-free? It's an interesting thought experiment, but a hard one to find a single plausible point of divergence for. Short of an apocalyptic event that sends human civilization back a few millennia, our species would likely open this radioactive Pandora's box eventually. That said, poor science, short-sighted bureaucrats, cheap politicians, concerned scientists, anti-Semitism, and even sexism have all at one point or another prevented humanity from getting the bomb sooner than we did. In the end, it was only the threat of Nazi Germany that eventually motivated enough nuclear physicists to convince the American government to spend the billions of dollars necessary to create the world's first nuclear weapon. So instead, let's assume we can create a nuke-free world by a combination of what I previously said. A couple famous scientists do some poor research and conclude that splitting the atom is impossible. Lesser scientists don't question them, and those who do usually aren't white Christian male enough to be taken seriously. Most governments aren't willing to spend money on something that will probably never work, thus physics remain a tiny discipline sheltered within a few university labs. So now we have our timeline without nuclear weapons. So what happens next? Well, the first question we have to ask is, how does this affect the end of World War II? In our timeline, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nuked on August 6 and August 9, 1945, respectively, by the order of Harry Truman, then President of the United States. Most believe that without the nuclear weapons, America and its allies would need to invade Japan, extending the war for months and leading to a tremendous loss of life. This is not a crazy assumption to make because Japan was expected to fight hard for the home islands given their defense of Okinawa and Iwo Jima. Additionally, soldiers were transferred from Manchuria and civilians were armed with bamboo spears to fight off American soldiers once they invaded. Japan's strategy seemed to be to fight one last battle that inflicted such heavy casualties on America that they would seek a negotiated peace rather than demand unconditional surrender. Thus, America expected casualties for the invasion, aka Operation Downfall, to be between 40,000 to 1.5 million. Meanwhile, events after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki seem to support this assumption, since some Japanese leaders continued to advocate against surrender and even staged a coup to keep Japan in the war. I'm not ashamed to admit that I too assumed that without nuclear weapons, Japan would have to be invaded. But when doing research for this video, I discovered that might not have been the case. For example, even if nuclear bombs weren't invented, there is evidence to suggest that Japan would still have surrendered. Before the nuclear attacks, Japanese cities were being indiscriminately firebombed, costing the lives of hundreds of thousands of people. Even more were fleeing the cities, causing a breakdown of the home front. Meanwhile, Japan's Air Force and Navy were non-existent at this point, and thus could not properly defend the home islands from attack. If this bombing campaign continued, then the devastation to all of Japan could be even greater than what happened to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This motivated the Japanese in our timeline to use the Soviet Union as a go-between to negotiate peace. The problem was that they wanted something less than unconditional surrender that would protect the emperor, but some members of the American government were willing to accept this. Thus, in our alternate timeline, these talks may have borne fruit, and the war in the Pacific could have ended before Operation Downfall, which the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, a report commissioned by the U.S. government to assess the effects of strategic bombing, predicted would happen if nuclear weapons were not used. In fact, Japan's desire to surrender may have become frantic after the Soviet Union declared war on Japan in August 1945. Getting the Soviet Union to enter the Pacific War was an important foreign policy goal for America in 1945, and perhaps they hoped the entry of the Soviets would by itself bring about Japan's surrender, because if Japan kept fighting, it would have given the Soviets more say in the post-war settlement of Asia. Did Japan fear their emperor would suffer the same fate as the Tsar? Maybe, but it does support the theory Japan would have surrendered to America before invasion was launched. Okay, so maybe nuclear weapons by themselves didn't end the war in the Pacific. So how does this impact the Cold War? Well, another popular theory about nuclear weapons is that they kept two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, from starting World War III. This was because of the threat of mutually assured destruction. Or, to put it another way, neither nation was willing to start a nuclear war because it would lead to complete annihilation of both sides. Thus, if nuclear weapons are taken out of the equation, the possibility of a conventional world war between the two superpowers becomes more likely. So what would happen if a conventional world war broke out between the Western capitalists and the Eastern communists? Well, it's hard to say because we won't know when or why such a war would erupt, but we can make some educated guesses on what would happen if it did. For example, the Soviets assumed that in a conventional war, their larger army would give them the advantage. Plus, the front would be a lot closer to their core territories, and they wouldn't have to ship reinforcements and supplies over an ocean like the Americans. Nevertheless, this hypothetical World War III better be a short, victorious one, because the Soviet thrust ever stalled and the war became one of attrition. America's industrial power would eventually swamp the Soviets. Plus, while America's army didn't match the Soviets, it did have a bigger and better navy that could deliver troops unopposed across the seas and strike at Soviet targets anytime they got near the coasts. Also, one can't forget that in our timeline, relations between the Soviet Union and China were poor despite their ideological similarities. Thus, there is no guarantee that China would join the Soviets in a general war against the capitalists, and perhaps if it was obvious the Soviets would lose, China may even declare war on them and try to gobble up as much of Siberia and Central Asia as they could. Then again, maybe the Soviets could still win because... Wait, I'm being told it's time for some more historical revisionism. The fact of the matter is that the use of nuclear weapons on Japan scared the Soviets. Even if it wasn't America's intention, Soviet leaders thought the atomic bombings were a message from America telling them that they would be next if they got out of line. It motivated Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union at the time, to expedite the Soviet nuclear program, diverting money and resources to it despite the fact that most of the country was still recovering from the Nazi invasion. The explosion of a Soviet nuclear weapon in 1949 touched off an arms race that almost led to nuclear war multiple times and eventually bankrupted the USSR. But in the world without the bomb, it's possible there would be less paranoia between the two superpowers. For example, during America's short-lived atomic monopoly, the Berlin blockade happened in 1948, in part because Stalin wanted to show America they were not afraid of their doomsday weapon. Thus, without the bomb, would Stalin still feel motivated to try and take all of Berlin from the Western capitalists? Maybe, but the need to prove they would not be threatened by a nuclear America would not be an issue. Furthermore, when you read about the Cold War, you get the feeling that the constant preparation for war was based on the intense fear that the other guy was going to shoot first, and yet neither the US nor the Soviet Union were ever really interested in pulling the trigger. They were just confident the other guy was going to do it if they ever stopped building bigger bombs and better ways to deliver them. Take city-destroying weapons off the table, and suddenly it becomes easier to deal with your rival. There's also the question of, why would World War III start in the first place? Not to downplay the pain and suffering they cause, but wars are bloody and expensive affairs and are not easy to start as grand strategy games would like you to believe. Even victors often inherit blasted cities, wrecked economies, and an uncertain future about whether they will survive the next one. Thus, even without mutually assured destruction, are ideological differences between capitalism and communism really enough to start a Third World War in the same century as the last two? Take America, for example, a country with a long isolationist streak that tends to join world wars late and only if provoked. Plus, the Western capitalists seemed okay with leaving the Soviet Union alone once the Russian Civil War ended. Sure, they intervened briefly during that conflict and oppressed communist voices at home, but attacking the USSR just because they were communists is a laughable idea. So why wouldn't this continue in this alternate timeline? Even Stalin, despite being the archetypal evil commie, tended to only pick fights with nations he thought he could beat, also known as all of Eastern Europe, and here his successors would gain little from warring directly against the US and their allies. And if the Soviets were to quickly swallow up some tiny neighbor, why would America care? In our timeline, we have a president question why we should be forced to fight a war over Montenegro, so it's not a stretch to think such a mindset would exist in this alternate timeline. The same can also be said about how much the Soviets would care if America overthrew a leftist government in Latin America. Okay, so maybe, at the very least, World War III isn't inevitable. Fine. But does that really mean history just plays out exactly the same way? Well, not exactly. Because there would be no nuclear arms race, there would be more money available for other things. In our timeline, nukes were seen as a cheap way in the long run to deter your enemy from attacking you, since it was incredibly expensive to equip large armies to do the same thing. Unfortunately, since neither superpower could agree on what was enough nukes to be an effective deterrence, both sides kept spending and spending, which was a race America was better suited for. In this alternate timeline, however, the two superpowers would be forced to face the reality of maintaining massive war-ready armies. Now, call me naive, but honestly I believe politicians, regardless of their beliefs, are not willing to part with that much cash, and I wouldn't be surprised if everyone is a lot more willing to negotiate. Thus, without the arms race, the Soviets wouldn't bankrupt themselves building more weapons and could instead spend money on other things, like consumer goods or their infrastructure. They may even have lasted to the present day. Or not. Maybe America would still try to outspend the Soviets and turn themselves into some sort of militaristic police state. Military parades would be more popular than the Super Bowl. It could happen. That all said, this wouldn't necessarily be a world without war, just that they would be limited affairs. Despite the argument that nuclear weapons make war unthinkable, there have certainly been a lot of wars in the last 74 years. Nukes didn't stop North Korea from starting the Korean War or China from intervening in the same conflict. They also didn't prevent the Vietnam War or the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. And that's just conflicts involving the two superpowers. You know, when you start to think about it, these weapons of mass destruction really are kind of worthless. They didn't cause Japan to surrender, they may have actually made the Cold War worse, and they certainly didn't stop wars from happening. So what is nuclear power good for? Well, actually, let's talk about nuclear power, i.e. civilian use of nuclear energy to generate electricity. This technology is linked with nuclear weapons, so if one isn't developed, the other wouldn't be either, presumably. Now, if I'm being honest, nuclear energy does have some benefits over other forms of generating electricity. For example, nuclear power is the lowest emitter of greenhouse gases, but only accounts for around 10% of the world's electricity production. Many have argued, like the International Atomic Energy Agency, that we can slow down the effects of climate change if more nations adopt nuclear energy. Thus, one could argue that without this tech, our current environmental crisis could be even worse. Then again, 75% of greenhouse gas emissions are created outside of electricity production, and, as I just mentioned, nuclear energy is only responsible for a small fraction of electricity anyway, and only grows smaller as more aging reactors are shut down. Thus, even losing out on nuclear power wouldn't necessarily speed up climate change that drastically. We also can't ignore the big downside to nuclear energy, radiation. This is why nuclear waste has to be carefully stored lest it leak out into the environment. Meanwhile, meltdowns like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima would never happen in this alternate timeline. Thus, no nuclear energy means less radiation would be unleashed on the environment. Speaking of radiation, we tend to forget that there were more than just 2 nuclear weapons exploded in human history. Nuclear-armed nations tested their weapons during the Cold War, and these tests were less about science and more about wagging their atomic dick around. These explosions released radiation into the environment and over communities. Governments rarely did anything to protect these downwinders or compensate them once the effects of radiation, like increased risk of cancer, began to show up. In fact, cancer rates around the world may be lower in this alternate timeline because these explosions would not be happening. And let's not forget about the secret government experiments to test the effects of radiation on people. These test subjects were sometimes from marginalized communities who were kept in the dark about what was being done to them. There are several horrible examples of this in my own country, but one that always stuck out with me was detailed in Michael D'Antonio's The State Boys Rebellion. It tells a true story of orphan children, many with learning disabilities, being fed radioactive oatmeal just so scientists could see what happened. Which is sick. I mean, they were orphans. How can anyone justify such cruelty? Okay, let's talk about something less dark, like the infinite abyss of space. Would the space race, i.e. America and the Soviet Union's rocket race to the stars, be impacted by the lack of nuclear weapons? Maybe. Being able to launch an atom bomb, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, allowed the nuclear powers to strike at each other from the other side of the globe. So one would think that no city busters means less interest in rockets overall. This may be true, but we can't forget that rockets long predate nukes as weapons, and the ability to strike at your enemy from far away without them being able to stop it would still be intriguing to most nations, especially after missiles became more accurate. Plus, there are conventional ICBMs in America's arsenal today, so it's not crazy to think that rocket technology will continue to progress without nukes. Plus, there were other reasons for the space race, like national security, bragging rights, and of course, in very last place, a general pursuit of science. So, yeah, it could still happen in this alternate timeline. Nevertheless, this still may be an overall less technologically advanced world. Without the precedent of the Manhattan Project, there may be less interest in massive government spending on science. Plus, food production techniques and medical treatments that benefited from atomic research would be less advanced in this timeline. On the other hand, billions of dollars spent on technological dead ends, like nuclear-powered aircraft, would be available for something else. And what about pop culture? How would we entertain ourselves in this alternate timeline? Honestly, there's almost too many things to list with this one. A world without nukes means a world without Godzilla, Dr. Strangelove, or bikinis. Or at least they would be called something else, since the name wouldn't be popularized by all the nuclear tests that took place at the Bikini Atoll. We would also lose out on cheap sci-fi B-movies where something is giganticized by radiation, like them, and various superheroes, like Spider-Man and the Hulk, would either not exist or would get their powers from something else. It goes without saying that great works of nuclear holocaust fiction like On the Beach, Alas Babylon, and Resurrection Day wouldn't exist. No one would be terrified by films like The Day After or Threads, and classic video games like Fallout would never be created. Homer Simpson would also need to find a new place to work. Plus none of those stupid duck and cover drills. Since this video is getting long, I'm going to wrap it up here. I had a lot of my assumptions about nuclear weapons challenged by making this video. While I still think it is debatable whether nuclear weapons have been a force for good, there is no guarantee if nukes were never invented, it was inevitable that America would suffer a bloody invasion of Japan and later be drawn to a bloodier World War III. Such a gloomy timeline smacks of something nuclear bomb advocates would want you to believe, especially the ones who overestimate the effectiveness of nukes in deterring conflict while downplaying the negative impact nuclear energy has had on our world. And I fear those same people remain in charge of nuclear-armed nations today. Does that mean getting rid of all nuclear weapons will usher in a utopia? Probably not. Human nature allows us to be dicks to each other without civilization-destroying weapons at our disposal. That said, I don't think it is overly optimistic to imagine a timeline without nuclear weapons that isn't all that worse off than our own. And while it's too late for our timeline to turn back the clock, maybe one day most of us will live to see the last of these weapons put to rest. Well, that's what to say on the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrich, the Alternate Historian. Bye.